Some of you might have missals that have a different feast day today. Some of you might have a feast day called St. Joseph the Worker. And if you have that feast day listed in your missals, you might check the date of your missals because they most definitely come after 1955. They're either dated 1955 or later, I should say, because that feast day of St. Joseph the Worker was introduced in the mid-50s by Pius XII. All during the 1950s, there was this revolutionary fervor to change the liturgy. In fact, the committee was established to change the liturgy in 1949 already, and they were already setting at work there. And they were essentially under the same leadership from beginning to end until they produced the new Mass in 1969 and 1970. Now, you might ask, well, why do we still have the feast day of Saints Philip and James on this day? You might also ask a very good question, why was that changed then after centuries and centuries of Catholic tradition and replaced by a new feast day which had never been before of St. Joseph the Workman or the Worker in 1955? And the answer is, the introduction of that feast day of St. Joseph the Worker was part of the revolutionary process. You see, at the same time, there was going on the changing of Holy Week, and especially the rites of Holy Thursday, Good Friday, and Holy Saturday. The leaders of the modernists had said that if they could manage to change the ceremonies of Holy Thursday, Good Friday, and Holy Saturday, they could change everything, that there was nothing they could not change. And these were words that were almost prophetic. We see now how, in fact, they have done exactly that. In the middle 1950s, they changed the rites of Holy Week under the name of restoring them, restoring the primitive rites. This was the battle cry of the modernists. They disguised themselves as wolves in sheep clothing because they were saying, let's restore the ancient rites of the church, the primitive rites of the church. And so they set about inventing what those were. They rejected the rites that the church had observed for centuries and centuries, wanting to scrap them in favor of reconstructing the, quote, primitive church, as they said. And of course, all that did was give them the power to change things according to their particular ideology of modernism. And so we saw the rites of Holy Week changed. At the same time, this ceremony of the St. Joseph the Worker feast day was instituted. And the message was, things are changing. You see, we have to realize that the revolution in the church was not an event, it is a process. It was a revolutionary process. It started out with basic principles. These were modernist principles. And based upon those modernist principles concerning the liturgy, they began the changes, and so they used the same principles all the way through, year after year, to continue the process of change until they finally got to the New Order Mass. And then they continue the changes even from there. So the idea was to institute this revolutionary process of change based upon these certain principles. Little did people know in 1955, 1956, and so on, when they were accepting the changes there, that they were establishing the principles of the modernists that would justify all the changes that would come in the years afterwards. So that those who accepted the changes in 1955 and 56 were actually establishing, by that acceptance, the principles of the modernists, which justified everything else they've done. That is why it's necessary to reject those principles. We have to reject the revolutionary process, which embodies those principles. Because if you accept those principles, then you justify everything they have done. That is why it's so important for traditional Catholics to be fully traditional. and not to fall into the trap of trying to find some kind of a mixture of Catholicism and modernism. For example, when the priests earlier on in the years of the changes accepted them, they probably accepted them with a certain amount of enthusiasm because there was a lot of cheerleading about how wonderful they were going to be and they were going to create a new springtime in the church. But there were some priests who, as the years went on and they saw more and more of these changes, they saw these changes were not beneficial to the church. They were doing damage to the church. They were doing damage to souls. And they saw a loss of faith as a result of them. And so many of those priests who saw that decided they were not going to continue on that bandwagon of the modernist changes, but they were going to go back to the more traditional practice. But some of them said, well, I've accepted all of the changes up to 1967, so I really see the new Mass is not right. I'm just going to follow all the changes up to 1967. Other priests said, well, I'm going to go back and follow the practices as they were in 1965, 1963, or 1962. Others, 1960. Or others had accepted the new Holy Week rites and said, well, that's where I'm going to draw the line, the 1950s. But they didn't realize, perhaps, that by doing that, they were actually creating a kind of collage liturgy, which was a mixture of the traditional elements that they liked and the Novus Ordo, or the New Order elements that they found acceptable. And so they kind of pieced together a liturgy which really the church had never actually approved, but was just something that was a kind of compromise, something of a mixture of Catholicism and modernism. But how is that possible? It isn't, according to the mind of the Catholic Church. It can't be. Now, my dear faithful, in being here and having the feast day of Saints Philip and James, you are worshiping as your Catholic ancestors did for many centuries, going back to the time of St. Thomas Aquinas and beyond. This was the feast day they knew of on this day, May 1st. Unfortunately, not only was that sacrificed, the feast day of Saints Philip and James sacrificed to make room for the feast of St. Joseph the Worker, but unfortunately there was also sacrificed the beautiful feast day of this Wednesday, the solemnity of St. Joseph, the spouse of the Blessed Mother, patron of the Universal Church. You know that during Lent you have a feast day of St. Joseph, but after Easter you have a solemnity of St. Joseph, which is a greater feast day. And sad to say that that also was, well, annihilated. I suppose there are some saying, well, we're traditional, so we do both. St. Joseph the Worker on May 1st and the Solemnity of St. Joseph, we have both of those. But that's not the traditional liturgy of the Catholic Church. So I think it's very important on this feast day, knowing that some of you probably have a 1960, 61, 62 missal, and you are looking at a feast day of St. Joseph the Worker. You need some questions answered. The answer really is not to become half traditional and half modernist. In your worship, the answer is to be fully traditional. The Catholic thing to do would be to go back before the modernists began making their changes in the liturgy. Go back before they were empowered to use those toxic principles of modernism to change the worship of God for you and me and for the Catholics throughout the world.